elderly black woman humiliated at the bank. But the Mafia boss was there. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Let's get started with today's story. The sun was setting on a warm afternoon as Margaret Hayes, a 72-year-old black woman, stood in line at the First National Bank. Her hands were slightly trembling as she clutched her worn purse tightly. Despite her frail appearance, there was a sense of quiet dignity about her. She had worked tirelessly all her life, cleaning homes for wealthy families, saving every penny she could. Today, after months of sacrifice, she was here to deposit the money she had painstakingly saved to cover her property taxes. The small house her late husband had left her was all she had left of their 47 years together. However, standing in the line, surrounded by polished suits and cold marble floors, she couldn't help but feel out of place. As Margaret approached the counter, she was met with a dismissive glance from the young teller, whose name tag read Brandon Mitchell. He looked at her, then at the crumpled envelope she placed on the counter. "Cash?" he asked, his tone dripping with contempt. "Do you know how much paperwork this will require?" Margaret, her face flushing with embarrassment, nodded silently. She had counted the bills herself. She had done everything by the book, but she was met with nothing but disdain. Brandon, who appeared to be no older than 30, held the envelope with 2 fingers, as though it were something vile. "You do realize that depositing this much cash is highly unusual, right? You should have come prepared with documentation. You know, proof of where this came from," he said, his voice laced with judgment. Margaret felt the sting of his words, the humiliation of being treated as though she were a criminal for simply trying to pay what was owed. She could feel the eyes of the other customers behind her, their stares like daggers, their whispers like a sharp wind against her skin. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but the words stuck in her throat. She had never been one to make a scene. She had spent her life staying out of the way, keeping her head down, working hard. But now, she felt the weight of every single struggle she had endured. "I've been coming here for over 30 years. I'm just trying to pay what I owe," Margaret muttered, her voice shaking. Brandon smirked, clearly enjoying the power he had over her in this moment. "You'll have to wait while we investigate," he said coldly, pushing her money back toward her as if it were a dirty thing. Margaret stood there, stunned, her heart sinking. She had given all she had for this. This was the last chance to keep her home, the only thing that connected her to her past. She stood frozen, feeling small, invisible in a world that seemed to have no place for her. As the humiliation washed over her, she heard a voice. It was quiet at first, but it cut through the tension in the air like a knife. "Did I just hear you correctly?" The voice belonged to a man, tall and imposing, dressed in a tailored black suit. Margaret turned to see him standing just behind her, his sharp blue eyes fixed on Brandon. He was a stranger, but something about him was commanding. The entire room seemed to freeze. The young teller, still smirking, barely noticed the man who had just stepped forward. The stranger moved slowly, deliberately, toward the counter. "What is this?" he asked in a tone that, despite its calm, had an edge to it. Brandon, clearly intimidated by the man's presence, stammered, "Yes, sir, this is a simple deposit issue. She's trying to deposit cash without any supporting documentation." The man's gaze never left the teller as he slowly slid the envelope back to Margaret, then looked at Brandon. "You're treating this woman like a criminal. You do realize that?" he said, his voice cool, but with a force that made everyone around him take notice. The teller recoiled slightly. "I'm just following protocol, sir." "Protocol?" The man's voice grew colder. "You will process this deposit immediately, and I want an apology for treating her this way." Brandon's face turned pale, his arrogance now replaced with fear. "But sir," the man cut him off. "Do it now." Margaret, still in a daze, watched as the teller reluctantly began processing the deposit. The man's presence was like a shield around her, and for the first time in hours, she felt a flicker of hope. The tension in the bank was palpable. People were whispering, watching the exchange, but no one dared to interrupt. After what seemed like an eternity, The teller finished the transaction and handed Margaret a receipt, his hands shaking. The man, who had remained silent through the process, finally turned to her, his voice softer. "Are you okay?" he asked, his gaze full of concern. Margaret blinked, still stunned by the events that had just unfolded. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. She had no idea who this man was, but his actions had restored a sense of dignity to her in a world that had so often tried to take it away. The Mafia boss, as the whispers around her would soon reveal, had just done something no one else in that bank would have dared. He had stood up for her, a woman no one had cared about. As he turned and walked toward the door, Margaret felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She would never forget the man who had given her back her dignity in the most unexpected way. The man who had come to her defense was none other than Dominic Castellano, a figure of quiet power whose presence seemed to command the room, even without a word. As the transaction was completed, and Margaret held the receipt in her trembling hands, she couldn't quite believe what had just happened. The harshness of the bank, the humiliation, and the bitter taste of injustice seemed to meld away under the weight of Dominic's unexpected intervention. The room was still, as people tried to process the sudden shift in energy. Margaret glanced at the man who had just saved her dignity and wondered who he really was. He wasn't just some random person. There was something about him that felt different. His commanding presence, the way he carried himself, even the way he dressed, spoke of authority and wealth. But it wasn't just his status that caught her attention. It was the way he had spoken up for her when no one else did. No one had ever treated her like that before. With a final glance at the counter, where the teller stood still in shock, Margaret made her way to the door, unsure of what to do next. Dominic had already left, his footsteps echoing in the polished marble hall as he walked toward the exit. Margaret, still in a daze, followed him out of the bank, the cool air of the late afternoon washing over her as she stepped into the street. For a brief moment, she forgot all about the troubles that had been weighing on her shoulders, her overdue bills, her fears of losing her home, and the constant struggle to survive. She was simply grateful for the kindness of a stranger who had not only seen her, but had also protected her. As Margaret walked to the bus stop, she heard the familiar rumble of a luxury car pulling up beside her. She turned to see a sleek black vehicle come to a smooth stop right next to her. The window rolled down, revealing Dominic, who was sitting in the driver's seat, his eyes studying her with a mixture of curiosity and something else she couldn't quite place. "I don't think you should take the bus today," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Let me give you a ride." Margaret hesitated, her instincts telling her to be cautious. She had heard stories about people who lived in the shadows of power, people who had too much control and used it without mercy. But there was something different about Dominic. There was no threat in his voice, no sign of manipulation. He simply looked like someone who cared. And that was something Margaret hadn't experienced in a long time. Still, she knew better than to trust too easily. "I'm fine. Thank you," she said politely, though her words were laced with hesitation. Dominic, however, didn't let her walk away so easily. He smiled, a soft but genuine smile that made her heart flutter. "Look," he said, "I know this may seem strange, but I'd like to help. Let me at least make sure you get home safely. It's the least I can do after what happened today." Margaret felt the sincerity in his words, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like someone cared about her well-being. She knew it wasn't common for people in her situation to receive kindness from strangers, let alone someone with so much power. But there was something about Dominic that made her think twice. With a reluctant sigh, she nodded and walked over to the car. As she got in, the door closed with a soft click, and they were off. The car glided through the city streets with ease, Dominic at the wheel, his hands steady and calm. As they drove, Margaret glanced out the window, the familiar sights of her neighborhood growing closer. She didn't speak at first, unsure of what to say, but the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. Dominic seemed to understand that she needed time to process. After a few minutes, he spoke again, his voice softer now. "I know this is a lot to take in, but I want you to know that what happened today wasn't right. No one should be treated the way you were, especially not in a place like that." Margaret glanced at him, her eyes meeting his. "Thank you for standing up for me," she said quietly. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't been there." Dominic gave a small nod, his eyes focused on the road ahead. I couldn't stand by and do nothing, he replied simply. You didn't deserve that. As they approached her house, Dominic slowed the car to a stop. Margaret turned to him, a mix of gratitude and confusion in her eyes. She had no idea why this man, a complete stranger, was offering her so much help. But there was one thing she knew for sure. He had restored her faith in humanity. She opened the car door and paused for a moment, looking at him. Thank you, she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic smiled at her once more, a warmth in his expression that made her feel safe. Take care of yourself, Margaret, he said gently. And remember, you're not invisible. With that, he drove off, leaving her standing on the sidewalk, a strange mix of emotions swirling inside her. The kindness of one man had changed everything. But Margaret had no idea that this was just the beginning of a much bigger story, one that would change her life forever. As the days passed, Margaret couldn't help but think back to that moment in the bank. The way the man, Dominic, had stepped in and taken control of the situation was unlike anything she had ever experienced. She had been humiliated, her dignity stripped away by the people who were supposed to be serving her. Yet, in an instant, Dominic had changed everything. It wasn't just the fact that he had defended her, it was the way he made her feel seen, something she hadn't felt in so long. The weight of her struggles seemed to lift for the first time in years, and for the first time, Margaret allowed herself to believe that maybe there was hope. That evening, as she sat at the small kitchen table in her modest home, a cup of lukewarm tea in her hands, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change. She had always worked hard, scraping by with every penny she earned, but now, she was starting to question everything she had believed about herself. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Margaret wasn't expecting anyone, and for a brief moment, she hesitated. She stood up slowly and walked to the door, peeking through the peephole. It was Dominic. A sudden rush of nerves hit her as she opened the door. Hello, Margaret, he said, his voice as calm and reassuring as always. He was standing there, dressed in a dark suit, his posture confident, yet not imposing. It felt like he was here for something important. Can I come in for a moment? He asked. Margaret stepped aside, still unsure of why he was here, but feeling an odd sense of trust. As Dominic entered, he looked around her humble home with an air of quiet respect. I know this may seem sudden, he began, sitting down across from her at the table, but I couldn't stop thinking about what happened at the bank. You deserve better, Margaret. No one should treat you like that. His words were simple, but they struck her deeply. She had spent so long in the shadows, feeling invisible, that hearing someone acknowledge her worth made her heart swell with something she hadn't felt in years, appreciation. I don't know what to say, Margaret murmured, unsure of how to respond. You don't have to say anything, Dominic replied, but I want to offer you something. I've been thinking about it for a while, and I think it could make a difference for you. Margaret's mind raced. What could someone, like Dominic, a powerful figure she barely knew, want to offer her? I'm offering you a position in my organization, Dominic continued, his eyes steady on hers. I know you've been struggling, and I think you have skills that would be valuable to me. You've been cleaning homes for years, and I've seen the work you've done, how thorough you are, how dedicated you are. I want you to work for me, but not as a maid or a servant. I want to offer you something more. Margaret stared at him in disbelief. She had worked for rich families, cleaning their mansions, but the idea of working for someone like Dominic, someone who clearly controlled so much, seemed impossible. What kind of position? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dominic leaned forward slightly, his voice quiet but firm. You would be in charge of overseeing the cleaning and maintenance of my properties, but more than that, you would be in a trusted position. I would make sure you have everything you need, health care, a stable income, the chance to live without worry. You wouldn't have to struggle anymore. Margaret felt the weight of his words, and for the first time in years, a spark of hope flickered inside her. She had never imagined a life like the one he was offering. It felt like a dream, one she couldn't quite believe was real. Why me? She asked, still unsure of what to make of this offer. Because I've seen the way you work, Dominic said. You don't just clean. You take pride in it. You do it with integrity. And that's something rare in the world I operate in. People like you. People who have humility and respect, they're not easy to find. I value loyalty, and I'm offering you a chance to be part of something bigger. But only if you want it. Margaret's mind was spinning. It wasn't just the offer itself, it was the way Dominic made her feel like she mattered. In all her years of working for others, no one had ever taken the time to truly see her, to acknowledge her worth. And now, here was this powerful man, offering her a chance to change her life. She felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her. Could she accept this? Could she trust him? I'm not sure what to say, Margaret said, her voice trembling. Take your time, Dominic replied. There's no rush. But I want you to know that I mean it. I want to help you. You don't have to live like this anymore. As he stood to leave, Margaret felt a mix of emotions welling up inside her. She had always fought for everything she had, never expecting anything more than what she could earn with her own two hands. But now, she was being offered something she had never imagined, an opportunity to escape the struggle. As Dominic stepped out the door, he turned back to her, his expression softer than before. Think about it, Margaret, he said gently. You deserve more than this. With that, he left. Margaret stood there for a moment, the weight of his words settling in her heart. She had no idea what the future held, but one thing was certain. Things were about to change, and she was ready to take the first step. The next few days passed in a blur for Margaret. She spent her time in the quiet comfort of her small home, the weight of Dominic's offer hanging heavily in her thoughts. She had never been one to accept charity or gifts, especially from someone so powerful, but there was something about Dominic that made her reconsider everything she had believed about herself. His offer wasn't just about money or status, it was about respect. And for someone like her, who had spent her life invisible in the eyes of others, that meant more than anything. The thought of no longer having to struggle to make ends meet was both a relief and a terrifying idea. What would it mean to work for someone like Dominic? Would she lose herself in his world of power and influence? Or would she be able to hold on to the dignity she had fought for all these years? It wasn't just the job that worried her, it was everything that came with it. On the other hand, the opportunity was rare. She couldn't remember the last time someone had treated her like she mattered, let alone offered her a chance to change her life. Dominic had seen something in her that she had never seen in herself. It was a small seed of hope, something she hadn't dared to believe in for years. Finally, after days of wrestling with her thoughts, Margaret decided to take the plunge. She would meet Dominic the next day to accept his offer. But as she prepared for the meeting, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something much bigger than just a new job. The next morning, Margaret arrived at Dominic's office, a sleek building that stood in stark contrast to her modest home. She stepped inside, feeling a mix of awe and nervousness as the doors opened before her. The lobby was pristine, filled with marble floors and polished chrome, the kind of place that made her feel like she didn't belong. She took a deep breath and walked to the front desk. I'm here to see Mr. Castellano, she said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. The receptionist smiled warmly and nodded, directing her to the elevator. When the doors opened to Dominic's floor, she was greeted by another sleek, modern space. The walls were adorned with contemporary art, and everything seemed so perfectly put together. As she walked down the hall to Dominic's office, she felt like she was stepping into a world that was beyond anything she had ever known. When she finally arrived at his door, she knocked softly, unsure of what to expect. Come in, Dominic's voice called from the other side. Margaret opened the door and stepped inside, her heart racing. Dominic was standing by the window, looking out at the city skyline. He turned to face her as she entered, his expression calm and welcoming. Margaret, he said, his tone warm but serious. I'm glad you came. Please, sit down. He gestured to the chair across from him. Margaret hesitated for a moment before sitting down, her eyes meeting his. There was something reassuring in his gaze, something that made her feel like she wasn't just a maid or an outsider anymore. She was someone who mattered. I've thought about your offer, she began, her voice a little shaky but firm. And I've decided to accept. Dominic smiled slightly, a hint of approval in his eyes. I'm glad to hear that. I believe you'll make an excellent addition to my team. His words, though simple, were filled with sincerity, and for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt like she was being seen for who she truly was. But I want to make something clear, she continued, gathering her courage. I've worked my whole life as a cleaner, a maid. I've never had anything handed to me. I won't start now. If I'm going to work for you, I want to earn my place. Dominic's expression softened. I would never ask you to do anything less. You'll earn everything you're given here, Margaret. But I promise you, you won't have to struggle the way you've been struggling. I'll make sure of that. His words filled her with a sense of calm that she hadn't expected. This wasn't just about the job. It was about the opportunity to finally build a life where she didn't have to fight for every scrap. I appreciate that, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm not used to being given anything, but I'm willing to try. I want to make something of myself, Dominic. I don't want to just exist anymore. I want to matter. Dominic leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. You already matter, he said softly. And that's why I'm offering you this chance. There was a long pause as they simply stared at each other, the weight of the moment settling between them. Margaret felt a surge of emotion, a mix of gratitude and fear, as she realized that this was more than just a job offer. It was a lifeline. For the first time in years, she felt like she had a future. After a few moments, Dominic broke the silence. There's a lot to discuss, but we'll take it one step at a time. For now, welcome aboard, Margaret. I think you're going to do great things. She smiled, a real smile this time, and nodded. Thank you, Dominic, she said, her voice filled with emotion. I won't let you down. As she left his office that day, Margaret felt like a new chapter was beginning. There was still uncertainty, still fear, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had the chance to create something better for herself. The future wasn't as frightening anymore. It was full of possibilities. And no matter what came next, she knew she had the strength to face it. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of change for Margaret. The life she had once known, one of endless struggle, of scraping by from one job to the next, began to feel like a distant memory. Working for Dominic was nothing like the work she had done before. No longer was she scrubbing floors in the homes of strangers, her efforts unnoticed, her worth measured only by the work she could do. Now, she had an office, a space where her thoughts and ideas were valued. Her days were filled with meetings, discussions, and decisions that once seemed far out of reach for someone like her. The responsibility was overwhelming at times, but it was also empowering. She was no longer invisible. She was a part of something important, something that mattered. It wasn't just the job, though. Dominic's offer had been the beginning of a transformation that went far beyond her career. For the first time in years, she felt like her life had purpose. She could buy what she needed without wondering how to stretch a dollar further. She could pay her bills on time, something she had never been able to do before. And for the first time in forever, she didn't have to worry about losing the only home she had left. But with all of these changes came a new kind of pressure. Margaret had always lived simply, never asking for more than what was necessary. Now, she found herself surrounded by luxury. Dominic's office, his private spaces, the elaborate dinners and meetings with influential people. She felt out of place at times, like an outsider in a world where she wasn't sure she belonged. But Dominic had made it clear that he valued her for who she was, not just for the work she could do. He trusted her, and that trust meant everything to her. One afternoon, after another long day at the office, Margaret was walking out to her car when she saw Dominic standing by his own vehicle, waiting for her. He had been distant for the past few days, occupied with matters of his own, and Margaret had noticed the change in his demeanor. It was rare for him to step outside of the office after hours, and as she approached, she could see the tension in his posture. He was wearing a dark jacket, his eyes focused on the city lights ahead. When he saw her, his expression softened slightly. Margaret, he greeted her, his voice calm, but with an edge of something else. I need to talk to you about something. Margaret paused, her heart skipping a beat. She had grown accustomed to their casual conversations, but there was something about his tone that made her uneasy. What's going on? She asked. Dominic looked at her for a long moment before answering. I've been thinking a lot about the business lately, he said slowly. There are a lot of people, a lot of players in my world. I've built this empire over years, but things are getting more complicated. There are risks, people who want to take what I've built, and I need someone I can trust. Someone who isn't afraid to stand up for what's right, even when the stakes are high. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She had seen Dominic's world, the power, the ruthlessness. She had heard whispers about the things he did to protect his empire. She had heard about the deals, the alliances, the enemies. What are you asking me to do? She asked, her voice steady but her mind racing. Dominic's eyes locked onto hers. I'm asking you to be part of this. More than just an employee. I'm asking you to be someone I can rely on. You've already proven you have the strength to make tough decisions. I need that now more than ever. I can't do this alone, Margaret. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Margaret felt the weight of his request pressing down on her. She had never been someone who craved power or control, but what Dominic was asking her to do was different. It wasn't about the power, it was about standing up for what was right, even when it meant putting yourself at risk. It was about protecting the things that mattered, the things she had never been able to protect before. She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. She had worked her entire life to survive, to make sure she had a place in this world. And now, she had the chance to make a real difference. I'll do it, she said, her voice firm. I'll be there for you, Dominic. I won't let you down. He nodded, his eyes softening. I know you won't, he said, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. I trust you, Margaret, more than anyone else. The next few weeks were a blur of new responsibilities and challenges. Dominic's world was far more complex than Margaret had ever imagined, and every day brought new obstacles. But through it all, she found herself rising to the occasion. She was no longer the quiet, invisible woman she once was. She was a part of something bigger, something that had the potential to change everything. And with Dominic's support, she knew she had the strength to face whatever came next. It wasn't just about the job or the power, it was about making a difference. Margaret had finally found her place in the world, and as she stood by Dominic's side, she realized that this was only the beginning. The following weeks felt like a whirlwind for Margaret. With every passing day, her life began to shift in ways she could never have predicted. Dominic's world, one that had once seemed so distant, was now hers to navigate. The responsibilities that came with her new position were both overwhelming and empowering. Margaret had always worked hard, but the work she was doing now felt more meaningful, as though each decision she made had a direct impact on the world around her. She had grown used to the quiet hum of office life, but things were about to take a dramatic turn. One evening, as she was leaving the office, Dominic called her into his office. She could sense something urgent in his voice as she walked in. He was standing by the window, his back turned to her, looking out at the city below. The mood in the room was tense, and Margaret's stomach tightened. I need your help with something, Dominic said without turning around. What's going on? She asked, trying to hide the unease in her voice. There's a situation, he replied, finally turning to face her. A person close to me is in trouble, and I need you to step in. It's complicated, and it's dangerous. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She had never been one to shy away from a challenge, but this was different. This was real, and the stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. What kind of trouble? She asked, her voice steady despite the surge of anxiety inside her. It's someone from my past, Dominic said, his voice grim. A business partner who betrayed me. I've been keeping an eye on him for a while, and now he's making his move. If we don't stop him, he'll take everything I've worked for. Margaret nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. She knew that Dominic wasn't the type to ask for help unless it was absolutely necessary. What do you need me to do? She asked, her mind already racing with possibilities. Dominic stepped closer, his eyes locking onto hers. I need you to go undercover, he said, his voice low and serious. I need someone who can blend in, who won't raise any suspicion. Someone with the right kind of presence. I trust you, Margaret. You've already proven yourself to me, and I know you can handle this. The words sent a chill down her spine. Going undercover was no small task. It meant stepping into a world where every move had to be calculated, every word measured. It meant putting herself at risk in ways she had never considered before. But Dominic's trust in her, his belief in her abilities, gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She couldn't back down now. I'll do it, she said, her voice firm. I'll do whatever it takes to help. Dominic's expression softened, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. I knew I could count on you, he said. I'll make sure you're prepared. We'll go over the details tomorrow, but for now, just know this. It's dangerous, and there's no turning back once you're in. Are you ready for that? Margaret took a deep breath, the weight of his words settling over her. She had never been afraid of danger before, but this felt different. She had built a life, a future, something she wasn't willing to lose. But she knew she had no choice. If she didn't act, everything she had worked for would be in jeopardy. I'm ready, she said, her voice unwavering. I'll do whatever it takes to protect what matters. The next day, they met in the office late in the afternoon, going over every detail of the plan. Margaret listened intently, absorbing every word as Dominic explained the mission. It was more complex than she had expected. The man they were targeting, the one who had betrayed Dominic, was a powerful figure in his own right, with connections in every corner of the city. He was dangerous, ruthless, and had the resources to disappear without a trace if he knew he was being watched. Dominic outlined a series of meetings, surveillance, and contacts she would need to engage with. It would require her to assume a new identity, one that would blend in with the circles of power Dominic had once controlled. She would need to act the part, gain his trust, and gather the information they needed to bring him down. The risks were high, but the rewards were even higher. If they succeeded, they would destroy a major threat to Dominic's empire. But if they failed, the consequences would be catastrophic. Margaret didn't flinch as Dominic spoke. She knew the stakes. She understood the danger, but she also understood the importance of what they were trying to accomplish. As the meeting came to an end, Dominic handed her a file, thick with information. "This is everything you need to know," he said. "You'll be ready for what's coming. Just remember, this isn't about playing nice. It's about survival." Margaret nodded, taking the file from him. She felt the weight of it in her hands, both physically and metaphorically. This was her chance to prove herself, to show that she could handle whatever the world threw at her. And she would. With Dominic's trust, she was ready for whatever came next. The days leading up to Margaret's undercover operation felt like a blur. She spent hours preparing, studying the files Dominic had given her, trying to familiarize herself with every detail of the plan. The more she read, the more she understood the depth of the situation they were facing. She was about to step into a world that was far removed from the one she had known, a world of power, secrets, and danger. It wasn't just about blending in anymore. It was about survival. Dominic had made it clear that the stakes were high, and that failure was not an option. The plan was set. Margaret would meet with their target, a man named Gregory Vitali, under the guise of someone with the influence and resources to make things happen. Gregory was a business associate of Dominic's former partner, the man who had betrayed him. He had connections with various factions in the city, and his reputation was one of power and ruthlessness. Margaret's role was to become someone he could trust, someone who could get close enough to learn his plans, gather the information they needed, and ultimately bring him down. As the day of the meeting approached, Margaret found herself standing in front of her mirror, adjusting her outfit one last time. She had always been careful with her appearance, but today was different. This wasn't just about looking presentable. It was about looking the part. She had to be convincing, to embody the role of someone with authority, someone who belonged in this world of high stakes. Dominic had insisted that she wear something elegant but understated. No flashy jewelry or anything that would draw too much attention. She had chosen a simple, sleek black dress, paired with heels that made her feel taller, more confident. The outfit was professional, yet it had a quiet power about it. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. She wasn't just Margaret, the housekeeper from a few months ago. She was someone else now, someone who could navigate this world, someone who could command attention without saying a word. But as she stepped out of the car and approached the venue, her heart began to race. The building in front of her was sleek and modern, its glass walls reflecting the city's skyline like a mirror. The kind of place that screamed wealth and influence. It was intimidating, but Margaret held her head high. She wasn't about to let fear stop her. Inside, the atmosphere was even more overwhelming. The air was thick with the buzz of conversations between well-dressed men and women, their voices low, filled with importance. Margaret scanned the room, looking for Gregory. She didn't know exactly what he looked like, but she had studied his profile carefully. He was tall, with dark hair, sharp features, and an air of authority that was impossible to ignore. She spotted him near the back of the room, standing next to a large window that overlooked the city. He looked every bit the part, confident, self-assured, and completely in control. As she made her way toward him, she felt the weight of the situation settle in. This was it. This was her chance to get the information they needed. If she failed, everything could fall apart. But if she succeeded, it would be a game changer. When she reached him, Gregory looked up from his conversation and met her gaze. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but no sign of surprise. He had been expecting her. "Margaret," he said smoothly, his voice deep and almost comforting. "I've heard a lot about you. It's a pleasure to finally meet you." She smiled, extending her hand. "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Vitali," she said, keeping her voice calm and steady. He took her hand, his grip firm, and led her to a nearby table where they could talk privately. As they sat down, Margaret couldn't help but notice how easily Gregory commanded the room. It was as if everyone around him was drawn to his presence, hanging on every word. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a force to be reckoned with. "I must admit," he said, leaning forward slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'm curious why you wanted to meet with me. Dominic and I haven't always seen eye to eye, but I've heard you've made quite the impression in his circle." Margaret kept her gaze steady, not letting any hint of nervousness slip through. "I think you and I have similar interests, Mr. Vitali," she replied, her voice confident. "I've heard a lot about your business ventures, and I believe there's potential for us to collaborate. Dominic may not be able to offer you what I can." Gregory raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Go on," he urged, his tone cool but interested. Margaret leaned in slightly, speaking in a lower voice, just loud enough for him to hear. "What if I told you I could offer you something far more lucrative than anything Dominic could ever provide? I have access to resources, people who are willing to help you expand your empire in ways you can't even imagine." Gregory studied her for a moment, his eyes calculating, as if weighing her words carefully. Margaret knew she had to tread carefully. This was her one shot. "I'm listening," he said finally. The conversation continued, each word a delicate dance, as Margaret carefully maneuvered her way into Gregory's trust. She had no doubt that he would try to manipulate her, to use her in his own game, but she was ready for it. She was playing her own game now. Every sentence she spoke, every glance she made, was calculated to draw him in, to make him believe that she was someone who could be of value to him. As the conversation wore on, Margaret could sense the shift in Gregory's demeanor. He was buying it. He was starting to believe her. And that was exactly what she needed. She had no intention of getting too close, of becoming entangled in his world. But the information she could gather, the leverage she could gain, would be enough to bring him down. With every passing minute, she was closer to succeeding. But she knew better than to get comfortable. This game was far from over, and the stakes were only going to get higher. As Margaret continued her meetings with Gregory, the tension between them grew. She could sense his interest shifting, the way he began to trust her more with each passing conversation. She had played the part well, offering him just enough information to keep him engaged, but she never gave him all the pieces of the puzzle. She had learned everything she needed to about his operations, his network, and the people he was working with, but the final piece of the plan was still missing. Dominic had made it clear that the moment Gregory trusted her completely, she would need to act fast. Time was running out. The pressure was mounting, but Margaret felt more confident than ever. It had been weeks since that first meeting, and every moment had brought her closer to the ultimate goal. The knowledge she had gathered had been invaluable, but now it was time to make the final move. One evening, after another long day of playing her part, Margaret received a text from Dominic. The message was simple but urgent. "It's time. We move tonight." Her heart raced as she quickly made her way to the prearranged location. Dominic had set up everything. He had the people in place, the resources ready, and now it was up to her. The plan was in motion. As she arrived, Dominic was waiting for her, his expression calm and determined. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low but filled with certainty. Margaret nodded, her resolve firm. "I'm ready." They had planned for every scenario. They knew how Gregory would react, how he would try to manipulate the situation, but they also knew how to outsmart him. Dominic had made sure Margaret was prepared. She was no longer just the woman who had been trying to survive. She was someone with purpose, with a mission. They were about to take down Gregory and dismantle his network, exposing him for the fraud and threat he was. As they walked into the room where Gregory was waiting, Margaret could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had come so far, had worked so hard to get here. This was it, the moment that would change everything. Gregory looked up as they entered, his expression confident, as if he thought the meeting would be just another deal, another way to extend his influence. But Margaret could see the shift in his eyes when he noticed Dominic standing beside her. He stood up slowly, his demeanor cautious but still arrogant. "Dominic, Margaret," he said, his voice smooth, but there was a hint of suspicion in his eyes. I'm glad you could join me. I assume we're here to finalize things. Dominic didn't respond right away, his eyes cold and calculating. Margaret took a step forward, her voice steady but laced with a quiet strength. Actually, Gregory, she began, we're here to end this. The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, Gregory seemed taken aback. But then, his arrogance returned, and he smiled smugly. And what exactly? You've been gathering information, playing your little games, but you don't understand who you're dealing with. You think you can take me down, but you have no idea what you're up against. Dominic finally spoke, his voice firm and unwavering. We know exactly who we're dealing with, Gregory. And it's over. Gregory's face faltered for a split second, but he quickly regained his composure. He turned to the men behind him, signaling for them to make a move. But before they could act, Dominic's people were already in place, surrounding the room with an air of authority. It was over. The walls had closed in. As the security team moved in, Margaret stood still, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the moment they had worked so hard for, the moment that would bring everything to light. Gregory, realizing he had lost, stood frozen, his arrogance replaced by fear. He looked between Dominic and Margaret, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. You think this is over? He spat, trying to regain some of his composure. You think you've won? But Dominic remained unfazed, his eyes locked onto Gregory's. You lost the moment you betrayed me, he said quietly. Now, it's time to face the consequences. As Gregory was escorted out, his empire crumbling before his eyes, Margaret couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. The weight of the past few weeks, the danger, the constant tension, all seemed to melt away. She had done it. They had done it. She had played her part, and now, the world would know the truth about Gregory Vitali. As they walked away from the scene, Dominic turned to Margaret, his expression softening. You did well, he said, his voice filled with quiet admiration. I knew I could count on you. Margaret nodded, a sense of satisfaction settling in her chest. I'm just getting started, she replied, the confidence in her voice unmistakable. This wasn't just about the victory. It was about everything she had learned, everything she had become. She had stepped into a world of power, of influence, and for the first time, she realized that she belonged. The future was hers to shape now, and she wasn't going to let anything or anyone stand in her way. The following weeks after the takedown of Gregory Vitali felt surreal for Margaret. She had played her part perfectly, and Dominic had made sure to follow through on their plan. With Gregory out of the picture, things in Dominic's world began to shift. The weight of that victory, however, was heavier than Margaret had anticipated. While she had taken down an enemy, the aftermath was far from the clean, simple resolution she had imagined. The next few days were filled with meetings, discussions, and careful strategies. Margaret found herself increasingly involved in Dominic's operations, handling delicate matters with the precision and confidence she had never thought possible. But the shadows of the past still loomed large over her. Despite the success, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, something unresolved. She had proven her worth, but the deeper she went into Dominic's world, the more she realized just how much power was still at play. One evening, after a long day of back-to-back meetings, Margaret sat alone in her office, reviewing the latest reports. The company was expanding, Dominic's empire growing stronger, but there was something about this new success that made her uneasy. She was part of something much larger than herself now, and with every step she took, she felt the weight of the choices she had made. The phone on her desk buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID read Dominic. A brief pause, and she picked up. Margaret, I need you to come by my office. Dominic's voice came through, firm but without his usual warmth. She had learned to read him by now. He was serious, and it was never a good sign when he called her like this. Margaret stood and grabbed her jacket, walking to his office with a sense of dread hanging over her. She had no idea what he wanted, but her gut told her it was something big. When she arrived, Dominic was standing by the window, looking out at the city below. He didn't turn when she entered, and for a moment, the silence felt suffocating. There's something you need to know, he said, his back still to her. I've been working on a project for some time now, something that could change the future of everything we've been building. Margaret listened intently, her heart rate increasing with the uncertainty in the air. "What project?" she asked. Dominic turned to face her, his expression hard. "It's a delicate matter. A deal with a powerful family. A business deal, but one that goes much deeper than the surface. I need you to be a part of it. It's dangerous, but it's essential to the future of our operations." Margaret felt her stomach drop. She knew the stakes were high, but this felt different. She had worked with Dominic for a while now, but she had always stayed on the edges of his world. Now, he was asking her to step into the heart of it. "Why me?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. Dominic stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "Because I trust you. You've proven yourself time and again. But this is bigger. I need someone who isn't afraid to take risks, to do what's necessary to protect what we've built. This isn't just about business, Margaret. This is about power. And if we don't act, we'll lose everything." Margaret paused, considering his words. Power. She had always thought she understood the cost of it. But Dominic was right. This was different. It was not just about gaining influence. It was about maintaining control, keeping everything they had worked for intact. "What do I need to do?" she asked, her voice low. Dominic gave a small nod, acknowledging the gravity of her question. "You'll be meeting with the family, handling the negotiations, making sure we're protected. It will involve getting close to them, gaining their trust." He paused, as if weighing how much to say. "It's dangerous, but if you can pull this off, it will secure everything for us, for the long term." Margaret swallowed, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She had always prided herself on being able to handle tough situations, but this was different. This wasn't just a simple negotiation. It was a test of everything she had become, everything she had learned since stepping into Dominic's world. "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice firm. "I won't let you down." Dominic's eyes softened for a brief moment, but there was no warmth in his gaze. This wasn't about trust anymore. It was about survival. "I know you won't," he said, his voice low and measured. "But you need to understand. This is the point of no return. Once you go down this path, there's no turning back." Margaret nodded, understanding the magnitude of what he was asking. She wasn't just a part of the business anymore. She was a key player in the game of power. As she left his office, the gravity of what lay ahead settled in her chest. She had been given the chance to prove herself, to show that she belonged in this world of ruthless decisions and high stakes. But as she walked down the hall, she couldn't shake the feeling that the path she was about to take would change everything, not just for Dominic, but for herself as well. The next few days felt like a blur as Margaret prepared for the most important meeting of her life. She had been given a role she could no longer step away from. Dominic's world was no longer a place of distant power. She was part of it now, and it was more dangerous and complex than she had ever imagined. The weight of the upcoming negotiations with the powerful family Dominic had mentioned pressed heavily on her shoulders. She had spent the last few days immersing herself in the details of the family's operations, their connections, their strengths, and their vulnerabilities. Every piece of information she gathered brought her closer to understanding the intricate web she was about to step into. But it was clear that this was not just about gathering intel. It was about influence, manipulation, and trust. The stakes had never been higher. Margaret spent the evening before the meeting going over her strategy, reviewing everything Dominic had shared with her. She needed to present herself as someone who belonged in this world, someone who could hold her own in the dangerous game they were playing. As the evening wore on, she felt the anxiety building inside her. She wasn't used to being the one in control of these kinds of situations, but Dominic had confidence in her, and that confidence was the only thing keeping her steady. The next morning, Margaret dressed carefully. She chose a tailored, dark blue dress that gave her a sense of authority, but also subtlety. She wasn't there to make a spectacle. She was there to do a job. As she walked into the conference room, she was met by the cold, calculating eyes of the family's representatives. The room was large, imposing, and filled with people who had no intention of making things easy for her. Their wealth was evident in every detail. The sleek furniture, the expensive suits, and the air of indifference they all wore. But Margaret held her ground. She knew this was her moment. She wasn't just representing herself. She was representing Dominic and everything they had worked for. The head of the family, a man named Leonardo Grimaldi, stood at the far end of the room, his eyes narrowing as he saw Margaret enter. "Ah, the woman of the hour," he said, his voice smooth but laced with a certain coldness. "Mr. Castellano must have a lot of trust in you to send you here." Margaret met his gaze with calm resolve. "He does," she replied, her voice steady. "And I intend to prove it." The tension in the room was palpable. The other members of the family watched her closely, sizing her up as she took her seat at the table. For a moment, no one spoke. Leonardo was the first to break the silence, his voice low and direct. "Let's not waste time. We know why we're here. We've been watching you, and I must say, your reputation precedes you. But let's see if you can deliver on the promises your boss has made." Margaret's heart raced, but her face remained neutral. She had prepared for this moment, and she wasn't about to let him intimidate her. "I'm here to ensure that both parties come away from this deal satisfied," she said, leaning forward slightly. "But make no mistake, I'm not here to be intimidated. If we're going to make this work, it has to be mutually beneficial." Leonardo chuckled, a sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Mutual benefit," he repeated, as if the words tasted foreign on his tongue. "We are not in the business of making deals with people who can't show their worth." He paused, his gaze lingering on Margaret. "And I must admit, you have yet to prove yours." Margaret stood tall, refusing to let his words shake her. "I've already proven my worth, Mr. Grimaldi," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Now it's time for you to prove yours." The room went silent at her words, the air thick with tension. Leonardo's eyes narrowed as he studied her, clearly taken aback by her boldness. For a moment, it seemed like he was about to retaliate, but instead, he gestured for one of his men to bring forward a file. As the man placed it in front of her, Leonardo spoke again, his tone shifting slightly. "We'll see if you can back up that confidence. Here's the deal on the table. If you can meet our terms, we'll have a partnership. If not, you can leave with nothing." Margaret opened the file, her eyes scanning the terms laid out before her. As she read through the details, her mind worked quickly, analyzing each clause, each condition. She could already see the flaws in the deal, holes that could be exploited if handled carefully. With a steady hand, she placed the file back on the table and looked up at Leonardo. "I see a few issues with these terms," she said, her voice calm but authoritative. "But we can work through them. I'm confident we can come to a better agreement." Leonardo's expression darkened. He clearly hadn't expected her to challenge him so directly. "You don't have the power to change these terms," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You are here because we allow it. Don't forget that." Margaret met his gaze without flinching. "I'm here because I have the leverage to make this work," she replied, her voice unwavering. "And if you want this deal, you'll listen to my terms." The room was quiet for a moment as Leonardo processed her words. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes still locked on hers. "You're bold, I'll give you that," he said slowly. "But boldness alone won't get you far. Let's see if you have the ability to back it up." The tension in the room was thick, but Margaret remained calm. She had come this far, and there was no turning back now. She would win this deal. She would prove that she belonged in this world. And if that meant playing hardball, then so be it. This was her moment, and she would make sure she seized it. The hours that followed Margaret's confrontation with Leonardo Grimaldi were tense. As soon as she left the meeting, the gravity of what she had just done began to sink in. She had challenged a man who was accustomed to having complete control over every situation. She had faced him head-on and, for the first time, had forced him to reconsider his position. That was no small feat. She walked back to her office, her mind racing with the possibilities of what this meant for both her future and the future of Dominic's empire. The deal was far from settled, but she had planted the seeds of doubt in Gregory's family's mind, and that could make all the difference. As she entered her office, the weight of the file she had brought back with her seemed to be heavier than before. This wasn't just paperwork. It was a blueprint for the power struggle she had stepped into, a world of calculated moves and delicate negotiations. And now, it was her job to figure out how to turn the leverage she had gained into a final victory. The next few days were a blur of tense meetings and strategy sessions. Margaret found herself more entrenched in Dominic's world than ever before. It wasn't just about the business anymore. It was about survival. Every word she spoke, every move she made, was being watched closely. The people around Dominic were looking to her, expecting her to prove that she belonged. And she had to keep proving herself. The pressure was unrelenting, but Margaret had learned to embrace it. Her resolve had only strengthened with every challenge she faced. She wasn't going to back down now. Her loyalty to Dominic had been solidified by the trust he had placed in her. And as they continued to work through the negotiations with Gregory's family, Margaret realized that she wasn't just playing the game. She was becoming an integral part of it. But the stakes were rising. As the days went on, she started to see the darker side of the power they were dealing with. The people they were trying to take down were ruthless, and they would stop at nothing to protect their empire. There were whispers of betrayal, hidden alliances, and threats lurking in the shadows. Margaret had always been able to handle pressure, but the stakes were higher than ever before. One evening, after another long day of tense meetings and back-and-forth negotiations, Margaret found herself in the office with Dominic. He was looking over the final details of the deal, his face grim as he scanned the documents in front of him. "We're almost there," he said quietly, not looking up from the papers. Margaret stood across from him, her eyes scanning the information as well. She knew they were on the brink of something major. This deal would change everything, but it was far from done. "Do you think they'll agree to our terms?" she asked. Dominic paused for a moment, clearly considering the question. Finally, he looked up, his expression intense. "They don't have much of a choice. We have them cornered." He stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared out at the city below. "But don't let your guard down. There are always surprises, always someone trying to pull the strings from behind the scenes. This isn't over yet." Margaret nodded, understanding the weight of his words. She had already seen how far some people were willing to go to protect their power. She wasn't naive. She knew that this deal could fall apart at any moment. But she also knew she had the strength to handle whatever came next. As Dominic continued to pace, his mind clearly focused on the deal at hand, Margaret felt a sense of determination fill her. She wasn't just here to observe or to help Dominic succeed. She was here to make sure that they both emerged victorious. They had come this far together, and she wasn't going to let anything derail their progress. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady. Dominic turned to her, his expression softening for a moment. "I know you are," he replied. "I trust you, Margaret." The words felt heavy, but not in a burdensome way. They were a recognition of everything she had done, of everything she had become. And for the first time since she had entered this world, Margaret felt like she truly belonged. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of planning and final adjustments. They had one last meeting scheduled with Gregory's family, the moment where everything would be decided. If they succeeded, they would not only secure the deal but also solidify their position as the true power players in the city. As Margaret left the office that night, the weight of what was about to happen settled in her chest. Tomorrow would determine everything. She couldn't afford to fail. She would face Gregory's family one more time, and this time, they would either submit or be exposed for the fraud they were. There would be no room for mistakes, no chances for second-guessing. The moment was finally upon them, and Margaret was ready to seize it. She knew that the road ahead would be filled with challenges, but she had come this far, and there was no turning back now. The day of the final meeting arrived, and the air was thick with anticipation. Margaret had prepared for this moment in every way she knew how. She had studied the players, learned their motivations, and understood the stakes. This was it. There would be no second chances, no room for error. Gregory's family was at the table, and everything they had worked for was about to come to a head. As she stepped into the conference room, her heart raced. The atmosphere was electric with tension. Gregory and his associates were already seated, their expressions unreadable as they waited for her to join them. Dominic, ever calm, stood by her side, his presence a silent reassurance. Margaret took a deep breath, her mind focused and her body steady as she took her seat across from Gregory. The deal, the leverage, the risks, they all boiled down to this moment. The family members barely acknowledged her, their eyes trained on Dominic as he took his place at the head of the table. Margaret felt the weight of their stares, but she remained calm. This was the role she had to play, someone who belonged in this world, someone who wasn't afraid to take what was theirs. Gregory, who had been watching her intently since she entered the room, finally spoke. His voice was cold, dripping with a mixture of disdain and curiosity. "I must admit, I'm impressed," he said, his eyes narrowing. "You've played this game well, Margaret. But let's see if you can finish it." The words were a challenge, but Margaret didn't flinch. She met his gaze head-on, her voice unwavering. I don't just play games, Gregory, she replied. I win them. The room fell silent. The tension was palpable, the air thick with the sense that something monumental was about to happen. Dominic glanced at her, his face unreadable, but his eyes carried a silent approval. Gregory shifted in his chair, a slight smirk forming on his lips. Let's get down to business then, he said, sliding a thick stack of papers toward her. This is our final offer. Take it or leave it. Margaret glanced at the papers, but didn't immediately reach for them. Instead, she studied Gregory's face, his calculated confidence, and the subtle hints of desperation that lurked beneath the surface. She knew he was trying to bait her, trying to push her into making a move that would give him the upper hand. But Margaret had been in this position before. She wasn't going to fall for it. I've read your terms, she said calmly. But there are conditions we need to discuss first. You see, the power in this room isn't solely in your hands, Gregory. You've underestimated what I'm capable of. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the room was still. Gregory looked at her with a mixture of surprise and disbelief. He hadn't expected this from her. He had expected submission, or perhaps a desperate counteroffer. But Margaret wasn't playing by his rules anymore. What do you mean? Gregory asked, his tone shifting, a hint of uncertainty creeping into his voice. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving his. I'm here to make sure this deal works, for everyone in this room, she said. But I'm also here to make sure that Dominic's interests are protected, that no one walks away with more than they deserve. And if that means taking a harder line with you, so be it. The challenge was clear, and the silence that followed was heavy. For a moment, Margaret wasn't sure how Gregory would respond. Would he retreat, realizing that he had lost his footing? Or would he continue to push, thinking that he could still control the situation? The latter was always a possibility. But Margaret had learned from Dominic. The key to winning wasn't just about being tough. It was about knowing when to strike, when to let the other side expose their weaknesses. After a long pause, Gregory finally spoke, his voice colder now. You're making a mistake, he said. You think you have the power to change this deal, but you don't. You're just a pawn in this game, Margaret. You've played your part, but now you're out of your depth. The insult was clear, but Margaret remained unfazed. She had heard worse from those who had tried to break her down. I'm no pawn, Gregory, she replied, her voice low and steady. And you're about to find out just how out of your depth you are. With that, she signaled to Dominic, who nodded and motioned to the team waiting outside. The doors opened, and several security personnel entered, followed by law enforcement agents who had been on standby. The shift in the room was immediate. The tension that had once been oppressive now hung in the air like a storm about to break. Gregory's face paled as he realized what was happening. He tried to stand, but Dominic's men moved quickly, blocking his escape. What is this? Gregory demanded, his voice rising in anger. You think you can just walk away from this? Margaret stood, her gaze unwavering. It's over, Gregory, she said. You've been exposed. Your network is done. You don't get to dictate terms anymore. The weight of her words hung in the room as the reality of the situation set in. Gregory was cornered, and his empire was crumbling. Margaret had done it. She had secured the deal, turned the tables, and proven her worth. The family's reign of control was over, and she had played a central role in its downfall. As the law enforcement team led Gregory away, Margaret turned to Dominic, her heart pounding with both relief and triumph. Dominic gave her a small, approving nod, a silent acknowledgement of the battle they had just won together. Well done, Margaret, he said quietly. You've earned your place. The world they had fought to build together was now theirs to protect, and Margaret knew this was only the beginning of her true power. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. She had proven that she was no longer just an observer in Dominic's world. She was a force to be reckoned with, and she would shape her own destiny from here on out. Experience the thrilling journey of power, betrayal, and trust in this captivating story that blends tension and romance. In this tale, a woman named Margaret finds herself stepping into the high-stakes world of business and deceit, facing challenges that test her strength and courage. As she navigates the dangerous landscape of power struggles, she also encounters unexpected moments of tenderness and connection. The dynamic between Margaret and the enigmatic Dominic unfolds in a way that draws you into the complex world of elite decision-makers. Their story isn't just about business. It's about finding loyalty, navigating risks, and realizing that love can bloom even in the most unexpected places. If you're a fan of romance stories that blend action, suspense, and emotional depth, this one will keep you hooked from start to finish. With each twist and turn, you'll find yourself captivated by the unexpected moments of romance that emerge amidst the chaos. This is a tale that proves love and power are not mutually exclusive, and the complexities of both will leave you wanting more. Get lost in the world of romance stories and discover how power, trust, and love intertwine in the most compelling of ways.